This is an emergency. That is the thrust of what the government said yesterday about the early release of Islamist terrorists. An unprecedented situation of severe gravity is the phrase the Justice Secretary used. And yet, of course, an entirely predictable one. The think tank, the Henry Jackson Society, warned us at the end of last year that 180 Islamists have been released from jail early over the last 2 decades. They actually named the attacker in Streatham as one who was up for release. But now the government is promising to act, and it looks as if their plan is that the parole board might have a much greater say in what happens to these people, potentially keeping more of them locked up for longer. We'll hear from the head of the parole board in just a moment. But first, let's talk to Richard Walton, who's the former head of counter-terrorism for Scotland Yard, now senior fellow at the think tank, the Policy Exchange. Morning to you.
Good morning.
What do you think about what we know about what the government's planning?
Well, I strongly welcome the announcement yesterday. I think this has been long overdue. I've been calling for tighter sentences for terrorism offences for some time now, as have many of my colleagues and former colleagues. I've also been calling for terrorists to serve their full term with no recent licence, and we've got mostly the way there yesterday. But I think there's some way to still a further step I'd take, and that's potentially to introduce post-sentence preventative detention orders for the very small number of highly dangerous offenders to prevent release if we think, and if intelligence services think, they are a threat or remain a threat to security of the public.
So those would be essentially indeterminate added sentences.
Well, they would be very similar to what's been legislated for in Australia, which is post-sentence order. Basically, this is when an offender reaches the end of their prison sentence, they can be detained in custody for a further period after their sentence has expired. Now, obviously, this would be the case yesterday. Of course, there was a strong intelligence case about that individual, which is why there was such a strenuous effort to monitor him at great cost. Now, that if these orders were imposed or in place, this offender would not have been released yesterday.
To which a lot of people would respond, hang on a second, that feels like a panic-stricken measure in the face of something that is a real threat, but a threat that could be and should be dealt with without actually bending the law in that way.
Well, yes, I think we've become too soft, to be quite honest, on all of this. Release on licence is a privilege, not a right. And what happened yesterday is the government have tightened up the administration of prison release. They've not introduced retrospective legislation. And I think that moves, that moves justice back to where it is. The public expect protection, and they expect that to come ahead of prisoners being reformed, rehabilitation programmes, and all the rest of it, which is important stuff.
And you're saying, when it comes to retrospective legislation that people are so worried about, you're saying we should do it. We should be able to essentially change the overall sentence that someone initially goes into prison thinking that they had. These are people who are already in prison, that they should now face changes in their sentences retrospectively applied.
No, it's not retrospective legislation. This would be something quite different. And obviously yesterday was not retrospective legislation either. Yesterday was the tightening up of the administration.
Yes, no, I accept that yesterday wasn't, but if you've gone into prison expecting that you'll come out with a certain sentence, and indeed you've been given that sentence in open court, then for the sentence essentially to be lengthened is retrospective, isn't it?
No, it's not lengthening sentence. It's at the end of the sentence. If the individual, the offender, continues to pose a very serious risk to public safety, and it is judged based on intelligence that offender is going to go out and commit a heinous crime such as we've seen, mass murder and the like, then the government should have the power, in my view, or the Secretary of State should have the power to detain that offender for a further period of time on a renewable period under an order.
Mm. And just one thought about control orders as well, which is sort of another way of doing it, but a softer way in a sense, in that you would be released. But of course we had this system, although it was very much challenged at the time, where you're essentially under house arrest. Worth looking at again or not?
No, I think the control order is a red herring in this debate. We've seen, obviously, the extent of the monitoring, the surveillance on this individual yesterday, the day before yesterday. It costs a fortune. We're talking tens of thousands of pounds per week, up to hundreds of thousands of pounds per month, and up to £1 million a year to monitor one offender 24/7. So the measures and resources that were levelled against that individual were already comparable to any control order that I've ever monitored and supervised. So, this individual was already under strenuous monitoring and yet still was able to carry out what was an awful attack, and thankfully nobody was killed.
Richard Walton, thank you very much. And